Hey everyone, I actually get asked quite a bit what I do for a living, so I'm making this quick little video to kind of show you guys the scope of the differences between what I'm used to working with and what I'm working with on this build. My trade, I guess you could call it, is I'm a diesel electric locomotive mechanic. I fix trains. Now, just a couple of different parts that I'm going to show you guys. This right here is a standard 86 millimeter con rod from the Genesis Coupe. Now this is a factory con rod. You guys have seen it before in another video. This right here is the con rod from an MLW 251D locomotive. It's an Loco for anybody who knows anything about trains. And they were manufactured by Montreal Locomotive Works here in Canada a long time ago. This con rod is if I remember correctly the specs, it's a 9-inch throw con rod. The end cap is missing, but it's because I didn't take it. To kind of give you guys an idea, there's the bolt holes for the con rod. And the bolts for this con rod are actually bigger than the arm for a Genesis Coupe. So, and the bolts themselves are about that long. And they go in, and then they have a nut on this end. They don't actually thread into the con rod. They have a nut, and then they get wired to each other. I put this, that's basically the difference. I mean, even the big end on this is, and I can fit that in there. So, quite a bit different. This is 500 grams, or for the Americans, was a pound. And this here is, if I remember correctly, 80 pounds. It actually weighs more than the subframe, the thing that, supports the engine underneath the Genesis Coupe. That weighs more than it does. And there's probably more steel in it too. And like I said, I don't have the end cap, so it actually weighs a little bit less sitting here on this box than it should. And the end cap is huge. I mean, the end cap is like, I think it comes out to there. Now, a couple of differences between what you see in a standard automotive con rod is you'll notice there's no hole here, and there's only a single, I don't even know what those are called. It's a chamfered piston port, in my opinion. And it actually lubricates the wrist pin by using the oil injectors to squirt up to the piston, cools it off, and then it drips onto the con rod and lubricates the wrist pin. It's an effective enough strategy, but for locomotives, you need something a little bit different. And if you look, there's a hole right here. Oil travels through the crankshaft and then bleeds into the con rod. It then travels through this flute here, and it comes out right here. It then fills this chamber. Now, here's the thing. This is actually hollow. Or there's a hollow section in it, and the oil is coming from there and from there and from there, and it's bleeding into the wrist pin. And before we get too far into that, I'll grab a wrist pin and I'll show you guys where the benefit comes from. Alright, so this is a Genesis Coupe wrist pin. That's a locomotive wrist pin. I mean, the ports on the wrist pin are huge. I mean, like, I could drop 9 of these into there. So the wrist pin, going from what I was earlier saying, the oil comes through here and wraps around to the wrist pin. Now the wrist pin brings the oil in here, and it fills up a cavity inside the wrist pin. Okay, there's a sleeve here that actually seals that cavity. And then the oil is pumped out these 2 ports here. And these 2 ports actually lubricate where the wrist pin sits on the piston and transfers oil into the piston. And I'm going to have to clear this off because the box won't hold the weight. But then I'm going to grab a piston and we'll show you that too. Alright. Sorry. So the wrist pin, like I was saying, uses these ports here to transfer oil into the piston. Now the piston, as you can see, has little flutes in them, or in it. The oil comes around, spins, and goes into there. So it doesn't matter the orientation of this, it's going to get oil either way. Now that oil does two things. One, it acts as a coolant for the actual piston assembly. Two, the excess oil actually bleeds through these ports here and soaks the liner, which allows lubrication. It also transfers oil into here, allowing further oil lubrication at the top end of the assembly. Now the oil in a locomotive does act as a coolant, but it is very, very critical for the longevity of the locomotive or the mechanical engine to lubricate primarily. So while we've got these ports here at the bottom oil rail, these ports take excess oil from the liner, transfer it, and drop it into the oil pan. These ports here, though, are specifically for lubricating that conrod on the sides to bring the temperature of the conrod down. Also lubricating the crankshaft with oil dripping on top, in addition to the oil squirters at the bottom of the crankshaft squirting oil up at the crankshaft. Now, I don't have a locomotive crankshaft to show you guys because they weigh 14,000 pounds. So it's just not practical for me to have one to show you guys. But I will go a little bit more into the piston. You might have noticed there's two different metals involved in the piston. Now these are spent parts, they're not new. Okay, I'm not allowed to take new ones because they cost too much. And the scrap value on these are minimal. But what happens is we have a steel cap and an aluminum body, and that reduces the rotating weight, which allows us to have more power and allows us to go a little bit faster in the RPM. That steel cap is bolted, quite literally bolted, to the body of the piston. Okay, completely different than what you get in a Genesis coupe, which is all one piece, or a laminate, which this one doesn't have, but some automotive pistons have a laminate steel cap, and they don't always have a bolting mechanism. And the Genesis coupe's pistons have no oiling mechanism for that wrist pin at the piston, and it's just a completely different concept. These are built to produce 2,000, 4,000, and in some cases 6,000 horsepower constantly, 24/7, all year round, completely different than what a Genesis coupe or any other car will do. Even the Bugatti Veyron was not designed to produce 1,000 brake horsepower for 24 hours straight. Locomotives are. They're completely designed for that, and that's why everything is so huge. And it's not just power that we build things this big. And to withstand the power, we also build them this big in order to produce longevity. So there's more wear tolerance, there's more lubrication, there's more cooling in the heads. The heads are actually independent. None of them share each other, so they double as air cooled by air traveling across them, as well as having coolant go through them. And the radiator for one of my locomotives actually weighs more than a Genesis coupe does. Even a fully loaded V6, they actually weigh more than a Dodge SRT8 Challenger. So they're huge radiators. And it's all about completely moving the coolant through and getting rid of the heat as quickly as possible. Now the Genesis coupe's piston, by comparison, is, well, tiny, right? The wrist pin on this locomotive is actually bigger than a Genesis coupe's piston is. So, completely different kind of engineering. Now these locomotives are rated in horsepower only because we know generally what the RPM is, because locomotives have a fairly static RPM due to rotational ability. An Alco, like this one here, its max RPM is, I believe, 1040 RPM, and at that it's producing 2200 horsepower, or I believe it's 33,000 foot-pounds of mechanical torque. And we convert that using a generator into electricity, and then move it into DC. DC or AC. I believe ours are three-phase. No, ours are DC. Motors, and those motors actually are what move the engine and produce. We convert the electricity in order to be able to produce 400 or 500 horsepower, actually up to 600 horsepower per motor. But because of that, we're able to produce constant 86,000 foot-pounds of torque, and it's a bunch of gearing that goes in that's involved in that in order to produce that. So there is an actual ratio. It's not direct with direct feed. There is torque multiplication going on. But I thought you guys might get a kick out of this, kind of seeing the complete difference between this. Now, if you're wondering, the wrist pin weighs about 15 pounds. Yeah, weighs about 15 pounds, and it is solid steel with a steel liner that doesn't actually make any physical contact. The piston itself, the end cap on it, I believe is 20-something pounds, and the body actually doesn't weigh all that much. I believe the body weighs 8 or 9 pounds, and it's pure aluminum. Very much in contrary to the Genesis coupe piston that you guys see there, which I believe again is like 500 grams, a pound. So, yeah, I just thought I'd make this video to show you guys kind of the differences that I'm used to and that I'm used to working on versus the project and that you guys have been following along on. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys found it kind of educational. And if you have any questions or anything like that, just post them in the comments below. Post them up on the Project Woodstock thread, or even just message me on Facebook at Snoopy Panda. I'll see you guys in the next video.